Okay, welcome everyone to our Q4 Mojo event. This topic is Brothers in Service. We will be discussing the legacy of the 5 Sullivan brothers. Thank you all for joining us today, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. As we get started, we just wanted to go through a few housekeeping rules. The first and foremost is to please mute yourself throughout the presentation. We will have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the discussion. In the meantime, you're welcome to use the chat box feature to add any questions you have throughout the presentation. We can either ask them throughout if it's appropriate, or we'll hold it for the Q&A session at the very end. For the best viewing, please be sure to set your computer to speaker view until the Q&A portion so that you can see the full screen of all of the wonderful photos that we will be sharing today. And lastly, grab a cup of coffee and sit back and enjoy. I want to introduce our President and CEO, Mike Carr of the USS Missouri Memorial Association, who will introduce our speakers today.
Good afternoon again, wherever you may be. It's wonderful to have you here for our last Mojo session for 2023. It's pretty incredible to imagine that we're already at the end of another year. So it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers from the Grout Museum District in Waterloo, Iowa, a place familiar to my family because as I mentioned to them, I think that's where my father spent many of his early years before he moved to California. So it's my pleasure to introduce, in order, Pat Kenny, who has worked at the Grout Museum District since 2018 and is currently an oral historian. He's worked 40 years at several Iowa newspapers, mostly at the Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, and he's still a freelance journalist and writes a recurring blog post for the museum webpage. Also, Dr. Robert Niemeyer has been the historian at the Grout Museum District since 2002. His responsibilities have included exhibit research and development, conducting veteran oral histories, and working on the Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum. He's done research on Iowa immigration, and currently he's an adjunct faculty member at the University of Northern Iowa. And also Nicholas Erickson, who has worked for the Grout Museum District since 2014, and since 2017, he has served as the registrar and responsible for object acquisition and care. So without further ado, let me please introduce our speakers, and thank you all again for joining us today.
Nick, do you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Our first speaker, thank you very much, Mike. Our first speaker is Dr. Niemeyer, and we're going to begin by speaking about the boys' childhood and moving forward into their service in the Second World War.
Thank you very much. Sometimes we in Waterloo get to be a little unfamiliar, I guess, or people are unfamiliar with who we are. We're John Deere tractors. Long time ago, we were raft packing. And for many years after World War II ended, we were the home of the 5 Sullivan brothers. When I go talk to my classes these days, 20-year-olds do not know much about the 5 Sullivan brothers. In fact, virtually nothing about the 5 Sullivan brothers. But a group of people had the foresight 20 years ago to expand the local museum, the Grout Museum, into something which tells the story of Iowans' service and sacrifice in the years since the Civil War. We in particular have focused on World War II because it is the home place of the Sullivans, and it is also a place that is very patriotic, has supported the wars, sent people off, did the home front work, and has been a strong sense of who we are patriotically. So what we'll talk about a little bit today is the 2 things. We're talking about the boys themselves, who they were, what happened to them, and we'll be talking about the ship, the USS Juneau, and what happened to the Juneau, particularly when it was involved in the Battle of Guadalcanal. So let me start out with the Sullivans. The Sullivans were a good Irish family who came to Waterloo, Iowa to work in this case, Tom Sullivan worked in the Illinois Central Railroad. And in the process of working there, he was sufficiently successful to earn enough living so that he could provide for a family, a reasonably large family of seven actually children over a period of time. The Sullivans, we don't know much about them in their early years. They were Irish immigrants. They worked hard. They lived in the neighborhood along the Illinois Central Railroad, the North End, and they had 5 boys and 1 daughter. And the 5 boys became the focus of the story once their unfortunate death after the Battle of Guadalcanal. We have very little in the way of photographs of these families, but when you see what is probably the first photograph that we have of the family, at least part of it, with Tom and Alida. Tom, the man who worked at the Illinois Central, and Alida. And then we have George, and we have Francis, and we have Joseph in the far right. They were able to make a good living, as I said, by working with his work that he was doing. And they had 5 sons who became a bit of a legend. They were people who were young men who enjoyed life, did not enjoy school, sometimes didn't seem to enjoy work, but they enjoyed adventure. They enjoyed swimming on, floating on the Cedar River, which divides the city of Waterloo. And here we have we've captured at least a sense of what it was like for them as they sitting on the stoop watching the trains go by. Nick, let's go to the next one. Let us tell you what the Sullivans were not like. This is after their death, there was a Hollywood version of it called The Fighting Sullivans. In it, there were these images. Thomas Mitchell was the father. This is what it was like for the Sullivans. Not really. The Sullivans were a group of boys that were, as I said earlier, a bit of rough and tumble. And so the Hollywood version, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, was an attempt to generate publicity. It was obviously a very good profit-making operation. But many people remember the Sullivans in terms of Tom Mitchell and I think it was Ann Baxter and the boys. Next. They lived along the railroad track in this big rambling house that actually has a home for 8 or 9 of them, because Alida's mother, May Abel, lived with them as well. And there was an apartment upstairs for this house as well. It was a working class neighborhood. People down the street were a combination of Czech, Greek, African American, Mexican American. It was a very fluid society, and the boys enjoyed life, running up and down the streets, riding their bicycles, riding their motorcycles, which became a real favorite entertainment for them. And so in I think we have 1941. Let's look at that next photograph, Nick. We have, oops, I got something here. We have the family photograph that was taken after they had joined, I think after they had joined the Navy and before they shipped out. On the left, the youngest son, Albert, and just below him, his wife, Kina or Catherine. Let's keep going to the right. Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, Jim, Al and Kina's son, Genevieve, the daughter, and then we go up to, let me see, got to the left, it's George, Madison, Joseph, and Frank. Do I got that right, guys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good work.
Yeah, they look a bit alike. It was a family that enjoyed life, and as I said, were known for the boys for their escapades. here they are as young men, and they're just about, I think, to leave for the Navy training in 1942. Next,
Yeah, my notes say that this picture was made in January of 42.
January 42. All their life, as tranquil as it was disrupted, as with every other American, by the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And this is a friend of theirs, a young man named Bill Ball, who lived up in the country someplace. He was on the Arizona and was killed in the attack on the Arizona. They were close. They were friends. They were ball players, but most importantly, they liked to dance. And so they would go to Electric Park in Waterloo, where they would enjoy the life of young men, maybe perhaps trying to attract the interest of a young lady. They were known to drink and to enjoy themselves. But when Pearl Harbor came, they knew that they were destined to join the Navy. Actually, two of them, because it's Depression, two of them, the two oldest, George and Frank, had joined the Navy and did a 3-year stint, 1937 to 1940, before the war even broke out. Yes. This is a photograph of Tom, the father, to the lower left, and his brothers, which Patrick is one that we know well. Not only was their interest or the desire for revenge as far as the brothers were concerned, but it was their uncle, Patrick, who was also in the Navy as well and was highly thought of by them. And so the boys made the decision in early 1942, or actually late 1941, that they would join, and they would join together. They had this tradition of we stick together. As we talked to some of the older members of the community, one of them said, if you got into a fight with one Sullivan, you got into a fight with 5 Sullivan. And so the phrase "we stick together" was something that was in real life very, very much the case. When it came time to join the Navy, they made a decision. First of all, they made a decision amongst themselves that all 5 would go, even though Al was married and had a son. But the Navy was open to multiple members of family, and so in 1941, George, the eldest, wrote to the Navy, said, "We would like to join the Navy if we can all serve on the same ship." And there was precedent for this, including the ship, the USS Nevada, who had 6 brothers, all obviously from the same family, the Patton brothers, who were serving on that ship and were in Pearl Harbor and survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. So there was concern, however, on the part of the Navy. Some people, gentleman, a junior officer named Joseph Coleman, who actually turned the Sullivans down, said, "It's wartime. We don't believe it's appropriate to put 5 men from one family in harm's way," and he rejected the application. 2 days later, it was back in his desk. We don't know from whom, which said that publicity was the most important issue, and we'll take all 5 and we'll put them all on the same ship. And so in January of 1942, they moved off. They went to do their physical in Des Moines, and then went on to Great Lakes for training. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have you step in here pretty soon and pick up the storyline. But thank you, Nick. One of the brothers, this is the Joe writing to a friend back in Waterloo, put in a letter, and censorship wasn't an application yet, put in a letter that the people on the officers on a ship, as he referred to him, an ensign who was a big shot, told him, George, that all 5 brothers were going to be on the same ship. That was what they had sought. That was the goal. And in mid-January, they found out that apparently would be realized. it did not take long for them for the publicity side of the equation to be fulfilled. Here they are, and Nick, do you know the date on this one?
Uh-oh, that's at Juneau's commissioning, and the data that escapes me right now. Sorry.
Early February 1942. The classic hatch photograph of the five brothers. There are several versions of this. We always sort of look, the first thing we look at is the inverted V, which is a hatch marker. But in later photographs, that was turned upside down, and so it was not a pointer, but it was a letter V. And of course, in 1944-45, that letter V symbolically meant victory. And here were the five Sullivan brothers who had given their lives, sacrificed their lives, and the V on the hatch door was sort of one remembrance or indication of that. So the Sullivan brothers, this is the classics, the classic photograph. I should say we had a couple of other things we can add here for publicity. They were in New York as they got the ship, the Juneau, to get ready to go to sea. And they were squired around town to places like Jack Dempsey's bar and grill in downtown Manhattan. Probably it was not the best thing for five young Irish guys from Waterloo, Iowa, to turn them loose in the Jack Dempsey environment, but it was sort of an indicator that over the next 6-7 months, the brothers would find themselves in trouble with the officers there we go, thank you, for excessive drinking, for missing, not getting back to the ship on time. Let's do one more, Nick.
Hold on. Okay, that's Valentine's Day, 1942. If I'm
There
not-
you go. Very good.
That's the Patton brothers. Sorry.
These are the seven Patton brothers who were on the ship USS Nevada and survived Pearl Harbor, survived the entire war. In fact, they had two more brothers join them, and their father joined them on shore as they worked their way through the World War II in the Navy. Next one, Nick. And there's the Juneau, and I think probably here's where I step aside and let Nick and Pat start to pick up the story of, well, what the Juneau was and what its responsibilities in the war were.
Sure. So Juneau is an Atlanta-class light cruiser, CL-52. And this is a photograph of Juneau's fitting out. So in total, she had 8 twin 5-inch 38 mounts. So 3 forward, 3 aft, and then 1 on each beam, sort of amidships. And here, the third has yet to be installed forward here. She was conceived for one purpose, the entire Atlanta class conceived for one purpose, ultimately initially used unsuccessfully for another, and then eventually fell into an extremely effective role as anti-aircraft cruisers. But initially, the Atlanta class was conceived of as destroyer leaders, and you might think of USS Atlanta and then Juneau and then all the others initially as being super destroyers. So light-skinned, medium armament, very fast. I'm sorry, I don't know the top speed. But they were all equipped with depth charges. In fact, George Sullivan's battle station was the only battle station of all the brothers that was actually topside. He was on the fantail. He was a gunner's mate, and he was at the depth charge racks. In fact, Juneau's captain, Lyman Swenson, wrote a few letters to the Bureau of Ships complaining about, or at least voicing his concerns that Juneau and the other Atlantas would be used improperly. He was frightened that the Navy would not, they'd see these kind of beefy looking cruisers and use them, in the van for surface combat, or even in her sea trials, he was worried that her turning radius wasn't tight enough, and she couldn't, she could lead destroyers, but she couldn't actually engage in proper ASW on her own. And so he was not really sure what his ship ultimately would wind up doing. He also complained that the ice cream machine took up too much space. Let's see. Oh, I think I'll cover this. This is the last leave that the Sullivan brothers had before the ship left. So this was both of these photos were taken on May 24th, 1942. Joe Sullivan on the left is visiting his fiancee, Margaret Yaros, in Pittsburgh, and Albert and Madison on the right there went home to Waterloo, and that's little Jim, Albert's son, sitting on Madison's lap there. George was supposed to go with Joe to Pittsburgh, but for some reason didn't go. Bob, do you know anything more about that?
I do not. I was going to add, though, that the engagement was done by mail. His trip to Pittsburgh was the first time he had the opportunity to meet Margaret. Do not know what the exception was.
Oh, Bob, you picked this picture of the Missouri transiting the Panama Canal here to
The war was as long as the Sullivan, the Juneau rather, was in the Atlantic, they were chasing German submarines, or sounds at least of German submarines. When they passed through the Panama Canal to the Pacific, they entered the war. I mean, really, truly entered the war. And it was in about a month or so that they had fought the Battle of Santa Cruz. They got a battle star for it. But Santa Cruz was a very intense battle, and at which the Hornet, I believe, was lost. And it came as a realization to them, the five brothers, that this was serious business. This was a real war. And the question that came to the fore was, should all five of us be on the same ship at the same time? And the answer was not theirs to make initially, but there is anecdotal evidence, I know Pat has heard of this as well, that the brothers, after the Battle of Santa Cruz, were going to wait until the next port stop, and they were going to request that they be divided up. There were four Rogers brothers on the same ship. They decided to split two and two. Whether how valid that information is, we don't know. But the Battle of Santa Cruz before the Battle of Guadalcanal certainly pointed to the brothers that this was serious business.
Pat, do you want to cover the action of November 12th into 13th, 1942?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. Bob's right. Before, when they were at port at New Caledonia, they were offered an opportunity to split up, and the Rogers brothers did. I actually got to interview Jimmy Rogers, one of the surviving Rogers brothers, for the story for the paper years and years ago. He became a boxer and a restaurateur, but the Sullivan boys stuck together. They might have decided to split up after they got out of this Guadalcanal battle. They knew it was going to be hot. Little side note, they knew they were going into a hot area, and a lot of equipment and items on the ships that were considered flammable were switched off the ship. One of them was a floor mat with Juneau lettering in green letters. It was probably in front of a wardroom. We got that donated to us. I think sailor who was working in port, his descendants donated that to us in 2018 when we got footage of the discovery of the shipwreck of the Juneau. The battle was called, the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal is also referred to as the Battle of Friday the 13th, or the barroom fight with the lights out. The American ships were supposed to head off a Tokyo Express Japanese task force headed for Guadalcanal and the Marine garrison at Henderson Field. In the early morning hours of November 13th, the American ships inadvertently sailed right between the Japanese task force. And according to an article in American Heritage magazine from the 50s, Admiral Callahan was commanding the American ships, said odd number of ships fired to starboard, even number fired to port. And it was just, according to Juneau survivor Lester Zook, who we've interviewed several times at the paper, it was a pistol, he said, of a fight. Art Friend, who was another survivor from Missouri, said that he could see a Japanese ship in the flash of explosions as tall as a 10-story building that almost rammed into the Juneau. They're not too sure that the American ships didn't actually hit each other in some of the firefight. During that battle, the Juneau took a torpedo hit, I guess, in the forward fire room, and it was listing. The Americans got the worst end of it in terms of ship damage, but according to what Lester Zook told me in an interview years ago, he said, we lost the most, but in a way it was considered a victory for us because we delayed them from making further inroads on Guadalcanal. They held them off until the Marine garrison could be reinforced. So they, saved the Marines on the island, but at great cost. 12 of the 13 American ships were damaged in some way. The Juneau listing was steaming back to port was in a group of 5 ships. One of them was the USS San Francisco, which was pretty much decimated. Everything on the deck was just leveled, and they had a lot of wounded. The Juneau had sent a 4-person medical crew over to tend to wounded on the San Francisco. It was that bad. The Japanese submarine I-26 pulled up along the American ships and fired a spray of torpedoes at the San Francisco. 2 of the torpedoes missed. One of them, according to eyewitness accounts, porpoised under the San Francisco, popped up on the other side, went straight to the Juneau, smacked it right in the spot where the first torpedo happened the night before, and just blew it to pieces. I got an account here from Lieutenant Roger O'Neill, who was a member of the medical crew that was on the San Francisco. He said, I saw the spot where the Juneau had been. The only thing visible was tremendous clouds of gray-black smoke. The men told me the Juneau appeared to explode instantaneously and appeared to break into both segments, of which sunk in 20 seconds. The signalman on the bridge of the USS Helena was in the process of taking a message from the Juneau and had his glass trained on the signalman of that ship on the Juneau, and reports that signalman was blown at least 30 feet into the air. Lester Zook, who was one of the survivors we interviewed, I mentioned earlier, he was a signalman on the Juneau. I don't know if it's the same guy or not, but he told us that he was just sucked right under. All the survivors were off the fantail of the ship. Lester was sucked under. Eventually, he got pulled away from the stream, from the suction of the ship, and his ears began to clear, and he came up top. Frank Holmgren was another survivor from New Jersey. He said before they got into the fight, he had cut loose a stack of life rafts on the back of the ship in case they had to get to him in a hurry. That was pretty fortuitous of him because those were the ones that they used, that the survivors used. Frank was actually an aide to Captain Swenson, the commanding officer of the Juneau. He said the night before the fight, said the captain relieved me and said, go down and get some sleep because we're going to be up all night. So they knew they had trouble coming. Frank was sucked under too, and he said he got his hand on a life jacket. And he just said to himself, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. He blacked out. He still had his hand on a life jacket. Somehow he fastened it to himself. Lester said when they came to the surface, the surface of the water was covered with inches of oil. They were just covered in oil. He said it was even, he he couldn't see, but he heard some survivors who had gotten on one of these rafts yelling at him, telling him to swim this way. And he said it was really hard just to even swim hand over hand because the oil was so thick. The other thing he said was that there was just rolls and rolls and rolls of toilet paper all over the place. These guys grabbed the toilet paper rolls, took the still dry center out of those and wiped their eyes out so they could see. Lester thinks that there was maybe 120 sailors that survived the actual sinking out of the crew of almost 700, but every one of them was wounded, injured some way, you know, and in varying degrees. And well, and as we know, out of those survivors in the water, there was only 10 of them survived, plus the 14, plus the 4-man medical crew that was on the San Francisco. Some of them died of wounds, some of them died of exposure, and others died of shark attacks. Lester said some of the fellas died on the rafts, and they'd roll them off the rafts, and the sharks would take them, and the sharks followed them. They were at sea for about 7 days. There was a plane did come over and dropped a launch, an inflatable launch, and 3 of the sailors, including Lieutenant Joseph Wang, who was the highest ranking survivor, he was badly wounded. They got those guys off and got them to an island, but the other fellas, there wasn't room for the rest of them, and they were at sea for, again, like I said, 7 days. The largest group was the group that Lester Zook was on. Lester said of all of there was varying accounts, but Lester said of all the Sullivans, he only saw George. I think he was probably on the fantail with him. But George obviously didn't make it. Al Hine told in an account in American Heritage Magazine, Al Hine said that George went delirious and said, "I'm going to take a bath." He dove into the water, and Al Hine said a shark grabbed him. He said, "I saw the flash of his white of his body flash, and the shark grabbed him." I said that was the last I saw of him. Eventually, they had finally sent it, and the American ships didn't stick around because they saw the devastation of the Juneau and didn't think anybody could survive. Besides that, there were submarines in the area, and they didn't want to take any more casualties, so they kept going. That was a little bit of a subject of controversy. There was a court of inquiry, and I think Captain Hoover was subjected to that, but he was eventually cleared. I know Wyatt Butterfield, one of the survivors, was very bitter directly at Admiral Halsey for the way these guys were left behind. But the largest group was Lester Zook, Frank Holmgren, Wyatt Butterfield, George Mantier, and Henry Gardner were picked up by a PBY Catalina seaplane. They dropped some provisions. Wyatt Butterfield went out to get them, and sharks came after him. He had a knife, warded them off, and they basically said, "We're not going to wait around for these guys somebody else to come get these guys." So they landed in very choppy water. Bill Anderson, who was the crew chief on the PBY, and he actually came to Waterloo with survivors on the 50th anniversary commemoration in 1992. And he helped get them out of the water. And he said, "I knew there were sharks there." And he said, "I got in and out of there so fast, I don't think I even got wet." They pulled those 5 sailors on the ship, on the PBY. They said, "You got anything for us?" Some coffee. And he got some old coffee grounds they'd used before they took off, and the sailor said it was the best coffee they'd ever tasted. So yeah, and so it's the Sullivans' 5 brothers' death is considered the greatest loss of life by one family at one time in a single battle in American history. There were others that lost as many over the course of like the Civil War on both sides, but not that many at one time. And it's you talk about the legacy. On St. Patrick's Day 2018, the research vessel Petrel, an initiative of Microsoft co-founder and Seattle Seahawks owner Paul Allen, who they'd go out with an undersea drone and discover shipwrecks. They found the shipwreck of the Juneau on St. Patrick's Day. 2018. Kelly Sullivan, the granddaughter of Albert Sullivan, was made aware of this, so she got to see it. I had communicated with the Petrel crew when I was a reporter at the Courier, did an article on the discovery. It got a lot of play. About a day or so after the story ran, I got an email from an English professor in Sydney, Australia. He said that he and his wife had lived on Guadalcanal in the 60s. They had seen the vestiges of the battle. He sent a note to me and said, "Tell Kelly on behalf of all Aussies, thank you," because the Sullivans are considered to have died in the defense of Australia along with their shipmates on the Juneau. So the impact's felt by one family, obviously, because the loss of 5 brothers, we imagine all the descendants they would have had. You know, Jim Sullivan talks about that quite a bit. Kelly's father, Jim's Albert's son, he's in his 80s. He served in the Navy. He's retired from the city of Waterloo. He still lives in town here. We still have, you know, there was 2 ships commissioned. We've had USS the Sullivan's reunion here last year in 2022 over our Irish Fest celebration. Several members of the Sullivan's crew, active Sullivan's crew, have visited Waterloo. They make a strong connection, maintain a strong connection to our area, and Kelly is the official ship sponsor of the current USS the Sullivans, and she's probably has to be one of the most active sponsors in the Navy, and probably one of the best goodwill ambassadors this town has. So that's kind of what I have, I guess.
Thank you, Pat. So in December of 1942, the letters stop. And these are 5 unopened Christmas letters that one of Alita's friends, Nellie Turner, sent to the boys, 1 Christmas letter per boy. And they were returned to her. We're not really sure when she got them back. They're all postmarked, let's see, there's Albert's, postmarked December 10th. She probably got them back. Well, she would have had to have got them back before the end of December, because this was one of the first inklings that the family ever received that something was wrong. So Nellie went back to Alita and told her that all these letters had come back. There was also another rumor from a letter that some other sailor had sent home in Waterloo saying, "Isn't it too bad about the Sullivan boys?" And that eventually made its way back to Alita. And in early January, she wrote a letter to the Navy begging for word. Oh, sorry, here we go. Let's see, the envelopes are marked return to sender. There they are in our exhibit space, and it's museum policy that they'll never be opened. So Alita asked the Navy for word on the boys, and then on, well, January 10th, these dates sort of vary in some of the books, 9th, 10th, or 11th. Well, the family was given word. Bob, do you want to take it from here?
Fine, and just that one morning Tom was going to work, and he saw out at the window, he saw 3 naval officers walking up the steps, and he knew immediately what the problem was. There was a death. His question was, which one, referring to which of the 5 boys had been injured or died, and the response, of course, was all of them. And then, as Pat pointed out, there now opens up the story of how does the Navy deal with something of this magnitude. They were looking for publicity. They were not looking for this kind of publicity. And for the next 3 or 4 years, the Sullivan family, mother and daughter, and mother and Tom and Alita and the Genevieve went on tours. Here Tom is talking to factory workers in some industrial city. Another photograph will show him looking at parts. Tom was always quiet and was always behind the scenes, except when it came to being in a factory. Factories he knew, and he could pick up piece of material and talk about it with whomever the person was on the right. They traveled across the country. Some of the photographs clearly show the grief that existed. This was at the probably St. Mary's Church, Pat.
Looks like it's confused. Well, it might be St. Joe's, looks like too, maybe.
One of the Catholic churches in town.
Yeah.
And it was people who knew them said how terrible it was to meet them, to envision the agony that they were going to go through. People brought things on, and here's Genevieve and Nick. Tell me, Mr. Lang.
Wang, the officer on the far right of the frame is Chuck Wang, the only officer to survive Juneau's sinking. And here he is meeting them. I don't know if they met more than just the one time.
So it was very difficult for the family to reconcile the loss and the death. There is also this curious response by the city itself, where people said, well, the Sullivans are certainly getting a lot of attention. They're getting gifts and things. What about my son? I lost 2 sons in the war. Why don't they get the same sort of publicity and notoriety? In 1995, I published a book on the Sullivans, and we had a public place to sell them. And an elderly woman came up and said, "What did Tom Sullivan do when he learned about the death of the sons?" And the author who was there said, "Tom went and did his railroad run to continue the war effort." And she looked at him, and this woman looked at him and said, "That's not true. He went out and got drunk. And so therefore you didn't tell that story right. Everything in the book is nothing but lies." And she stomped off, very indignant, very sincere. So there was this backlash in the city that how do we treat the Sullivans? Do we treat them with respect, with dignity, with sympathy, or are they just trying to get all the publicity that they could? Nick, back to you.
Well, before we move on to the next picture, I want to point out that Lieutenant Wang has signed the back of this photograph, and to them, to the survivors of Juneau, and then the subsequent crew of DD-537 USS the Sullivans, Tom and Alita were like parents to them, adopted parents. And here, Chuck Wang has signed it to Mom, Dad, and Jen. Back to you, Bob.
Go back. Nick, you want to pick it up?
Sure.
The
Yes.
Hollywood experience. The family was brought to Hollywood to be sort of advisors to the Fighting Sullivans. This is at the in Los Angeles. Mrs. Sullivan is somewhat famous for her hats, and she is wearing a very unique hat. Tom is always sort of in the background, and as I alluded to earlier, Tom suffered from alcoholism, and it was something that he was able to control, to work with, and whatever. But it also made him very reserved and very always behind. Alita spoke for the family. Genevieve spoke for the family. And ultimately, we've been talking about Kelly. She now speaks for the family and for the entire ship.
Now, this is the dedication of Sullivan Park at the former site of their home at 98 Adams. Now, what year was this? Pat, you had the year down, right?
I think it's about, Bob, probably correct me, I think it's like 1964.
Yeah.
And that's Thomas and Alita and Genevieve in between them.
Feeling the. Go ahead.
Sure. This is 2008, the opening of our museum, and we actually just yesterday celebrated the 15th anniversary of the Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum of the Grout Museum District.
And
Um,
that's so Jim Sullivan cutting the ribbon, Al's son, and then Kelly, in the heavy black coat, the red hair is to his left of him.
There we are. And next, I'd like to run through some of the artifacts we have here, because as a registrar, I believe the artifacts can be used to tell the story as well. So first off is this shotgun. It is nothing but a normal 12 gauge single shot, about 1910. This was owned by the Sullivan family. Now, it's important, is on the butt here on the stock. You see the initials FHS. Now that's Frank Sullivan, who was carving his initials into the butt of this shotgun, but didn't finish. You see, he's got all three letters outlined. The F is the most complete, H is second most, and the S is just sort of traced in there. So he never got to finish this. And this piece is a good demonstration of sort of the nature of our collecting here since we were founded. So there was what's called the flood of Lower Gates Park of 1968 that basically wiped out all of the Sullivan's possessions. So their photos, letters, most of the stuff relating to the boys was gone. And this shotgun was brought to us actually on Veterans Day last year by a fellow named Merslack, who lived around the corner from Alida Sullivan in 1968. And when the family was throwing out bin after bin of things that had been destroyed in the flood, he pulled the shotgun out. And as he told us, he considered himself its caretaker all these years before he brought it to us. And actually, Kelly was there that day, just happened to be there that day when he showed up to present it to us. It was a heck of a day. This is George Sullivan's hat from his first enlistment, 1937 to 1940 there. Now, at some point during that first enlistment, he and Frank, the Sullivans and the Edwards family, another family in Waterloo, went to go visit George and Frank in, I think, San Diego. And while they were there, Dale Edwards, George's friend, and him, they swapped hats. And so that's how this hat wound up in the possession of the Edwards family. And eventually they donated it here to the museum. And inside the hat is George's name. Compare that to how he signs his letters. Pretty interesting. Here's a picture of George wearing the hat on the destroyer Hovey. He and Frank served aboard Hovey, part of the Asiatic fleet. Actually, George is at the far left of that image. For you ship nuts out there, this is a Christmas card that George sent home in, I think, 1938. The picture of Hovey there, and this is actually kind of interesting. Hovey was one of, I think, only 2 Clemson-class destroyers in the whole Navy to be equipped with those twin 4-inch 50 mounts. So it had 8 of those mounts, so 16 4-inch 50s in totals. Very powerful destroyer for its size. So along this sort of same theme of Sullivan artifacts and documents we receive are those that were preserved by other families. This is a selection from the photo collection of Pearl Schrader, a friend of Genevieve Sullivan's. And these are just snapshots. These were all taken in 1940. That's Pearl herself on probably Joe Sullivan's Harley Knucklehead. That's the family there. So that's Pearl Schrader on the far left holding the kitten. Madison is in front of her. Tom is behind her. Next to her is Keena, Albert's wife. Albert is at the far right there. And Genevieve is down below. It's important to me to include these photos. This is Alita Sullivan with Tom there on the left and Pearl there on the right. And you don't see a lot of photos of Alita Sullivan smiling. Most of the photos we have of her are after the brother's death. Now, she herself had actually already entered into a pretty severe depression that came and went over the course of the 1930s. She and Tom lost a baby girl in, I think, 1931 or 32. Pat and Bob, is that date right?
31 that I know.
Yeah. So she had these long spells where she'd be confined to her room, but this happiness did come out every once in a while. And I think not a lot of folks got to see it after 42. Here she is, again in 1940, as part of the Navy Mothers Club of America. And this is a meeting, I think, probably in Waterloo. And of course, that's because George and Frank were in the Navy when this picture was taken. And that's Genevieve on that same Harley knucklehead. This is a great picture. Genevieve, Madison, and Pearl. These two are kind of crazy. There's Madison in front of the car. They were very proud of their car. But then again, you know, the war's not even really a thought yet, but there's a photograph of Madison in 1940 with the American flag behind him. All of the Sullivan biographies that are available right now, and I suppose I just know of the three, mention that the only brother that was consistently interested in girls was Al and Joe a little bit. But here is, well, a love letter written by Frank to Wilma Richmond of Waterloo, Miss Wilma Richmond. It is very long, a very long love letter. He's written up the sides and in the corners. He signed it Frankie, XXX at the bottom. And part of the way through there, he says, don't worry about what you hear about all those other girls. It's just you. So there's more to the story. Okay. Jack Kolak is the fellow on the right here. And he and George Sullivan were good friends. Jack was something of well, what do you call it when somebody's into technology? He had a recording device. He was into audio recording. So he had a device that would record on mini 78s. And so the following recording here was made Friday, July 11th, 1941, after he and Al and George had gotten off their shift at Rat Packing Plant. So listen up. You can hear so say when our stars are happy, you're the whole world's light. But when they've clearly done a little drinking before they made that recording. And in fact, the beginning of that song is cut off. The beginning of this next song is also cut off. Because if it's like, I don't know, I have a little boy at home, and every time I try to record him doing something funny, I always miss the beginning of it because he's already started. And I think that's what Jack is doing here. He's catching them beginning to sing, and he's pushing record on the recorder. So I have to preface this next one a little bit. They are joined by Helen Leet, and Helen is also good friends with Jack and George. Eventually, she's going to marry Jack Kolak here, and you know, according to the family, she and George, prior to this, had maybe wanted to date. They were at least very, very good friends, but Helen's mother prevented it. She said that George was too old. I think there's only a 2-year difference between them, but I guess this was earlier when they were both younger, and that gulf is wider then, right? Either way, she eventually marries Jack, but according to one of George's shipmates on Hovey, I think it was on Hovey, a fellow named John Droughty, he witnessed George get a tattoo when he was with the Asiatic fleet on his arm that said Helen. And I've spoken with Helen's daughter, and I don't know, that it's almost certainly her. So there is either more or less to that story. We really can't know. But the reason why the biographers haven't put that together yet is by the time Helen was doing interviews in the 80s and 90s, she was going by Ruth. So if you read one of the Sullivan brothers' biographies, this woman here, Helen Leet, is the Ruth Leet in the Sullivan brothers' biographies. So they are going to sing a parody of When It's Springtime in the Rockies, and then it's hard to hear these recordings, so next there's going to be some discussion, and then George is going to attempt to sing When It's Roundup Time in Texas from memory, and then Al's going to try it next. Again, we're all pretty soused. The common denominator between all these songs is Gene Autry, so if you're wondering what they were, who they were a fan of, I guess that's him.
I'm coming back to you with a half pint in my pocket and my eyes so black and blue. I'm a friend of Anthony, and I hope that you want to. When it's springtime in Milwaukee, I'll be coming back to you. When it's round up time, Texas, on the stage. I would like to see the bacon fried and making coffee from my cat. It is just going to only one drinking coffee out of the sun. Oh, good.
Bear with me for this next recording. This is, again, we don't know the date of this one. It's probably right around the same time. Again, this is Helen Leet, Jack Kolock, and this time Frank. And Frank is going to tell a funny story about a fella he knows named George, not Brother George, possibly Uncle George, who lived in Harper's Ferry, Iowa. Just a funny story about raising rabbits. Again, difficult to hear. I include it because it's the only known recording of Frank Sullivan's voice.
Me and the show was named George. Well, they had a bunch of rabbits. Him and his wife, and I got in a hell of a row. Him and the guy that worked just scared the hell out of it. He gets mad every time I say it. Why I say rabbit? He gets mad every time. Why? He knows what I mean, dude. Oh. But I show that. What would they have about the rabbit? Well, I forget now.
Well, how come they can't sing about it?
Well, his name is George.
Oh.
George the rabbit? No, George. He is his husband's name. Oh, I see. You want to raise rabbits? Oh, you know how it is. You spend all the time with the rabbits and with the hair. Well, he's all right. What?
And then lastly, this is a recording of Genevieve practicing one of her speeches to factory workers. So I imagine she's at the Kolak's house. She's using Jack's recorder, and it's just really touching. The recording starts to break up at the end, but I'll just play the whole thing anyway.
Hello, fellow racers. It's an honor to be here today. Yes, I lost my 5 brothers, and I miss them terribly. I miss them more than words can say, but I remember their last words. This keep us up. Yes, I too remember their last farewell. I saw them off at the station in Waterloo. I saw them climb aboard the train in a blue jacket. A smile on their face, a tear in their eye. They had a job to do for the country. They did that job. Now, workers, I have a job to do. The job is picking up and carrying on where they left off. I know you're all with me to help me do that job. So keep up the swell job you've been doing, and if possible, work just a little bit harder. And when you're tired and you want to take a day off, please don't do that. For that one day may mean several lives are lost over there, because the boys didn't have the materials they needed so badly. I know the boys over there think of home a lot. They think of us back here, wondering what we're doing today, wondering if we're fishing for them. Yes, workers, we too can think of them. We can think of them over there, wondering what they're doing, wondering if they have enough to eat, if they're cold, if they're suffering, or if they're in pain. Yes, we can think, but we don't realize that those boys go through. Since we've been on this tour, we've had the privilege of going through hospitals, meeting the wounded that have come back, seeing them suffer. Fellow workers, those boys give up the comforts of home. They give up their freedom, yes, and some of them give up their lives. Mother, Dad, and I don't want sympathy. All we ask is that you workers stay on the job. Do your best. When the material is over, so it's needed that. Now it's thanks to metal in my heart doing. And the boys.
Pat already talked about this. So there's the wreck footage from Juneau, discovered on St. Paddy's Day, 2018. And actually what we're looking at right there in that frame is George Sullivan's battle station at the depth charge racks. Below that is the floor mat that was removed from Juneau. We actually have it nailed down. So it was removed from Juneau and warehoused at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides on the night of September 16th to 17th. Worked with the family and got that date nailed down finally. There is an identical floor mat at the City Museum in Juneau, Alaska. And we were able to independently corroborate that story with them. Jacqueline, we've gone over 5 now. Can I keep talking, or do I need to find some way to wrap this up now?
I think we can start wrapping it up so we leave a little time for questions.
Okay, very good. I'm going to shoot through the next few things and wrap it right up then. This is a picture of Murray Davidson Jr. in 1988 holding the Sullivan brothers, the Sullivan family Gold Star flag. In 2000, we got some state monies to have that conserved. We sent it up to the Northern States Conservation Center in Minneapolis. They did excellent work on it, patching it all up and mounting it on a board. Here it is on exhibit, a wildly difficult exhibit to photograph, given the nature of it. We built it like the bay window at 98 Adams. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is, sorry, sort of a depressing note, but it's a sad story. So after the tragedy, the first day of the rest of their lives began for the 700 families affected by the Juneau tragedy. Everybody got their MIA telegrams between about January 8th and maybe January 13th. And the Swenson family is the wife of Captain Lyman K. Swenson of the Juneau, received about a dozen letters from family members who were looking for information about their boy or husband or brother. And they all read kind of like this. Of course, she didn't have any answers to give them, but she kept all of them. So it clearly meant something to her. So I'll just read this letter in full, and that's how we'll wrap up. This was sent from a Mrs. Goff of Pittsburgh. Dear Mrs. Swenson, I do not know if such a person as you exists or not, but if so, we are sharing with you your grief in the loss of your husband if he is lost. Our boy, Julian Harding Lewis, was aboard USS Juneau and has also been reported missing in action. He was only 19 years old and went aboard the Juneau when she started out. We have heard no details, and while we still hope, if the paper reports on the manner in which the ship was sunk are true, I don't believe any of the crew had much chance. If you know the details of the sinking or anything about any of the crew being rescued, will you be kind enough to communicate with me? While our grief is great, that of the mother of 5 was greater. That's all we got.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Pat. And thank you, Dr. Neumeier, for sharing such a wonderful presentation about the legacy of these 5 brothers and our country's heroes. We do have a few questions that I wanted to pose to the panel to kind of get us started with the Q&A. One of them was a question that we kind of discussed before the presentation, and that's with all the many naming rights that the Sullivan brothers have received, you know, after their untimely death. How was that received by the town of Waterloo or the country at large?
I can address some of it. I gave the incident of the woman who didn't believe the interpretation of the author that I published simply because she didn't believe she was very upset with the Sullivans getting too much attention. It's a strange paradox where you have people who are grieving and yet passing judgment on other people who are grieving. There's a whole local history to that as well, but the bottom line is most people, as Nick pointed out, were deeply sympathetic to the family, and the loss of all those artifacts in 1960 or thereabouts in the flood makes our work really, particularly Nick's work, very, very difficult to do. But there you are.
I think there was a quiet period where there wasn't a lot said about Sullivans for a while. There was a bit in the 50s when the kids from St. Mary's School, they went to grade school, raised money, and they put up a statue of the Blessed Virgin at the church with the brother's name on it. That's now out of Columbus High School, our Catholic high school in town. And Sullivan Park fell into disrepair and vandalism. And late 80s, some folks decided to do something about it. Some of our prominent attorneys in town, and Admiral James D. Ramage, who was a Waterloo native, retired Navy Rear Admiral, was a dive bomber squadron commander on the USS Enterprise in World War II. Squadron mate of Butch O'Hare, for whom O'Hare International Airport is named. He spearheaded a drive to get our convention center renamed for the Sullivans, and he co-chaired with an attorney who was a Navy veteran in town, Ed Gallagher, the fund drive that built the museum here, which opened in 2008. And I think their memory and their legacy has been elevated quite a bit ever since for the last 30, 35 years. You know, I did an interview with Jim Sullivan years ago, and he said, I never made a big deal out of it. He's a very soft-spoken guy. And he said, I didn't feel like I should be saying anything that you owe it to me because I'm a Sullivan. Well, other folks stepped to the fore and he didn't have to. And Kelly really stepped up with her sponsorship of the ship and is very visible everywhere. She just got named chieftain of the entire Sullivan clan by her Irish relatives. They had a ceremony in Boston. She's the first woman and first American to be named chieftain of the whole O'Sullivan clan in Ireland. So it goes way out beyond our shores, more than we even know.
Well, that's very interesting. That kind of powers up my next question is, what is Kelly's involvement with your museum today?
Well, it's just intimate, intrinsic. She's here. She would have been here today talking to everyone, except she's got parent-teacher conferences. She's a 3rd grade teacher in Cedar Falls. She brings her classes here for museum school, along with all the other 3rd grader teachers all through our county and beyond. St. Mary's, the church, was ceased to use as a worship site in 2003, fell into disrepair and private ownership. City's got title to it now. It's pretty much an empty shell. Kelly got windows, painted glass windows out of St. Mary's Church for us to, we have a reflective area, honor roll of all of Iowans who have been lost in military service. And we have those windows on either side of that scroll now. We had them backlit and framed and everything. And I mean, she's always here, always doing that stuff. Nick, how he did, I don't know, but we secured Alita Sullivan's Navy mother's sash that she wore, and we presented that to Kelly last year on the 80th anniversary of the sinking of the Juneau, and you can imagine it was quite emotional for everyone.
Another question that came through was, have any other Sullivan family members served in our military since the five brothers?
Well, Bob talked about Patrick Henry Sullivan, who was Tom's brother, and he was in his 40s. He actually served on the USS the Sullivan's, the first one, the DD 537, that's in Buffalo, New York now. He just missed serving with his nephews on the Juneau. And if I remember the account right, I think Alita Sullivan intervened to get him on the USS the Sullivan's. So he served on that ship through the balance of World War II. And ironically, that ship was known as the Good Samaritan for its number of rescues of sailors and downed airmen, especially during Typhoon Cobra in 1944.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question before we have to wrap it up. And that is, what is the Navy's current policy now on family members serving together?
There is no Sullivan law. It's a policy, and the services define their policy as by the situation. But particularly in the world of National Guard and Reserve units, there are a lot more people going into the service, brothers and sisters, fathers, mothers, that I think it has, excuse me, I think it has to be done individually. Nobody seems to be willing to take that on as a political project.
There was a congressman from Wisconsin, Toby Roth, who tried to push a Sullivan law in the 1990s. He even got Kim Sullivan, Al's son, who also served in the Navy, to come out and lobby for it, but it did not clear. And I know just even our National Guard battalion here in Waterloo, we've had fathers, sons, and brothers serve multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. The Navy might be a little more selective about those kinds of things, because you can spread out a unit and a battalion, but guys on a ship are kind of in one spot. So, but it's never been a law.
If I may clear up some of the nomenclature surrounding the myth of the Sullivan Law. So there is a Sullivan Law. There's a law called the Sullivan Law. It's from the early 30s, and it's a federal prohibition against transporting a machine gun across state lines. So it has nothing to do with the Second World War. Now, the deaths of the Sullivan brothers actually did result in a pretty solid piece of naval policy. Actually, it might have been across the entire War Department, but I'm not sure. And that's called the sole survivor policy. So the Sullivan brothers' deaths resulted in the sole survivor policy, which has nothing to do with breaking up sets of brothers and having them serve in different units or on different ships. It is merely that if there is one sibling alive, like if a brother dies or multiple brothers dies, the last one alive gets to come home. And that's, I think, Saving Private Ryan, actually. That's what that is.
And when Steven Spielberg got his Oscar for Best Director, he cited the Sullivan family and, help me guys, the Nyland family from Utah.
Yeah.
4 brothers.
Very interesting. I wanted to thank you all again for the wonderful presentation and teaching us a little bit more about the legacy of the 5 Sullivan brothers, the work that you're doing there in Waterloo, Iowa. We appreciate you helping to continue that legacy of these naval heroes. So thank you for being with us again today as we wrap up our 4th Mojo of the year for 2023. We encourage all of you to continue to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. And a shout out to our coffee partners, the Old Salt Coffee Company, which is run by a bunch of Navy veterans themselves. So purchase a cup of coffee in honor of this Mojo event. We thank you all for being with us. I will be sending out follow-up emails to all of our participants with links to view the presentation again and a short survey about your time with us. Thank you again to Nick, Bob, and Pat for your wonderful presentation. We appreciate you guys being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.